Abandoned wife on the farm discovers pregnancy. But what he doesn't know is he's not the father. The morning Lysandra. Blackwood found the pregnancy test hidden beneath. Rotting floorboards in the abandoned farmhouse bathroom was the same morning. She discovered her husband, Thaddeus, had been planning her demise for months. The two pink lines stared back at her like accusatory eyes. But they held a secret that would have shattered Thaddeus's carefully constructed world had he known the truth before abandoning her in this desolate place. The child growing within her belonged to someone who existed only in dreams and shadows. A connection forged during those mysterious blackouts she'd been experiencing for the past 3 months. Episodes Thaddeus had dismissed as feminine hysteria, while secretly documenting them in preparation for having her committed. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of revenge and redemption. Don't forget to comment below with your theories about the baby's father. The farmhouse squatted like a diseased toad in the hollow between two mountains, its weathered boards groaning under the weight of decades of neglect. Lysandra pressed her palm against her still flat stomach, feeling the impossible warmth radiating from within as memories flooded back in fragments. She remembered the night terrors, the sensation of being pulled through dimensions, the golden-eyed stranger who had whispered ancient promises in a language that predated human speech. But those couldn't be real memories, could they? The pregnancy test trembled in her other hand, very real indeed. Dated 3 weeks after Thaddeus had stopped touching her, claiming she repulsed him with her episodes and erratic behavior. The truth was far more sinister than simple marital discord. Lysandra had discovered Thaddeus's journal that morning, knocked loose from its hiding place by the same rotten board that had concealed the pregnancy test. Page after page detailed his methodical plan to isolate her, document her supposed mental instability, and ultimately claim her substantial inheritance after her convenient disappearance or institutionalization. He had been poisoning her with hallucinogens to induce the blackouts, carefully calibrating doses to create symptoms of schizophrenia. What he hadn't counted on was that the drugs had opened doorways in her mind that should have remained closed, doorways through which something ancient and powerful had stepped. The farmhouse had been Thaddeus's masterstroke, purchased under a shell company and located 3 hours from the nearest town. He had brought her here under the pretense of a romantic getaway to salvage their marriage, then left her while she slept, taking the only vehicle and leaving behind a forged note in her handwriting expressing her desire to be alone to deal with her mental health issues. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles away across inhospitable terrain. The dirt road leading to the property was unmarked and known only to locals, and winter was approaching fast. He had stocked the house with exactly 30 days of food, betting that her pampered city upbringing would ensure. She perished long before anyone thought to look for her, but Lysandra Blackwood was not the fragile flower Thaddeus believed her to be. Behind her delicate features and refined manners lay the bloodline of women who had survived witch trials, frontier winters, and wars that had broken lesser souls. The pregnancy had awakened something primal within her, a fierce protective instinct that burned away the fog of drugs and manipulation. She studied the farmhouse with new eyes, cataloguing resources with the ruthless efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. The root cellar held preserved goods far older than Thaddeus's supplies, laid down by whoever had abandoned this place decades ago. The well still functioned, though the pump handle screamed like a banshee with each stroke. Most importantly, she found the previous owner's journals, detailing not just survival techniques, but warnings about the property itself. The land was cursed. or blessed, depending on one's perspective. The indigenous peoples had considered it a thin place, where the veil between worlds grew gossamer light during certain lunar phases. The farmers who had tried to settle it reported strange happenings: crops that grew overnight, animals that spoke in human tongues, and women who claimed to be visited by beings of impossible beauty who left them with children bearing unusual traits. The last entry, dated 40 years prior, spoke of a woman named Alara who had given birth to a child with golden eyes before both vanished during a particularly violent thunderstorm, leaving behind only scorch marks in the shape of enormous wings. Lysandra's hand instinctively moved to her stomach again as she processed this information. The blackouts aligned perfectly with the lunar phases mentioned in the journal, and the more she concentrated, the more she could recall of those lost hours. The being that had visited her was no hallucination, but something far older than human. Civilization, drawn by the combination of the land's power and her artificially opened mind. It had chosen her as a vessel, promising that the child would be her salvation and Thaddeus's undoing. At the time, lost in the drug-induced haze, she had thought it merely another delusion. Now, feeling the unnatural vitality flowing through her veins and the way shadows seemed to bend protectively around her, she understood the bargain she had unknowingly struck. The first order of business was securing her survival through winter. Lysandra had grown up wealthy, yes, but her grandmother had been a Depression-era survivor who had insisted on teaching her granddaughter practical skills despite her parents' protests. Those lessons, dormant for years beneath layers of finishing school polish, resurged with startling clarity. She inventoried the farmhouse systematically, finding tools, seeds, and equipment that suggested the previous occupants had been preppers of sorts. The root cellar's preserved goods were still edible, the canning equipment functional, and most crucially, she discovered a ham radio in the attic that might connect her to the outside world once she figured out how to repair it. Days blended into weeks as Lysandra transformed from abandoned wife to frontier survivor. The pregnancy progressed at an unusual rate, her body changing in ways that defied medical explanation. She required less food than she should have, drawing sustenance from sources she couldn't quite identify. Her senses sharpened to predatory acuity, allowing her to hunt small game with improvised traps when Thaddeus's supplies ran low. The farm itself seemed to respond to her presence, dormant fruit trees suddenly bearing out of season, vegetables sprouting in the neglected garden. Despite the approaching frost, she documented everything in a journal of her own, partly for evidence should she ever escape, but mostly to maintain her grip on a reality that grew more fluid with each passing day. The child within her was undeniably present now, moving with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat. During the full moons, when the veil thinned, she could almost see her otherworldly visitor superimposed over the mundane world. It no longer frightened her. Instead, she felt a fierce joy at carrying something that would transcend Thaddeus's petty cruelties. She learned from the previous owner's journals that children born of such unions possessed abilities that manifested gradually, often appearing entirely human until threatened. The golden-eyed child Alara had born had reportedly healed fatal injuries with a touch and spoken to animals as easily as humans before their disappearance. Winter arrived with a vengeance, sealing the farm in a cocoon of snow and ice. Lysandra had prepared extensively, stockpiling firewood, preserving meat and vegetables, and reinforcing the farmhouse against the elements. The isolation that Thaddeus had intended as her doom became her chrysalis. She grew stronger and more self-reliant with each challenge overcome, her soft hands developing calluses, her body adapting to physical labor despite the advancing pregnancy. The ham radio, finally repaired, crackled with distant voices, but she hesitated to use it. Something warned her that revealing her location too soon would bring danger not just from Thaddeus, but from those who might seek to study or eliminate. What grew within her? Her dreams during this period were vivid beyond description. The golden-eyed being revealed itself as one of many ancient entities that had walked the earth before human dominion and retreated to spaces, between spaces when iron and disbelief drove them out. They sought hybrid children to anchor themselves to this reality again, choosing carefully among bloodlines that carried trace memories of the old compacts. Lysandra's family, she learned, had been guardians of such boundaries for generations, before forgetting their purpose and settling into comfortable wealth. The drugs Thaddeus had given her had simply reawakened what lay dormant in her genetic code. By the time the spring thaw began, Lysandra was no longer the same woman Thaddeus had abandoned, 7 months pregnant with a child that defied natural law. She moved through the farmhouse with predatory grace, her eyes holding depths that reflected more than just the physical world. She had mastered every survival skill necessary, from butchering deer to foraging for medicinal herbs, from repairing the farmhouse to defending her territory against both natural predators and the occasional human who stumbled too close to her domain. The locals in the distant town, when she finally made contact through the ham radio, whispered about lights in the abandoned hollow and the return of the old strangeness that had driven out previous settlers. The detective Thaddeus hired to find Lysandra's body discovered her very much alive on a brilliant May morning, standing in a garden that belonged in a fairy tale rather than a remote mountain hollow. She was crushing herbs with a mortar and pestle, her swollen belly evidence of a pregnancy that Thaddeus's carefully documented timeline said was impossible. The detective, a pragmatic woman named Cordelia Shaw, felt the wrongness in the air immediately, the way reality seemed to bend around the heavily pregnant woman, who turned to face her with eyes that held too much knowledge. Lysandra had been expecting visitors for weeks, warned by dreams and the behavior of the enhanced wildlife that had become her early warning system. She greeted Detective Shaw with a calm that unnerved the seasoned investigator, offering tea brewed from herbs that seemed to sharpen the mind and loosen the tongue. The conversation that followed was unlike any interview Shaw had ever conducted. Lysandra provided detailed evidence of Thaddeus's crimes, from the poisoning to the abandonment, all documented in her meticulous journal. She also showed Shaw Thaddeus's own journal, which he had found in the farmhouse and which contained his entire conspiracy in his own handwriting. But it was the pregnancy that dominated Shaw's attention and eventual report. The medical examination that Lysandra reluctantly allowed revealed a fetus developing at an impossible rate, with genetic markers that didn't match any known human configurations. The local doctor, sworn to secrecy, could only confirm that Lysandra was indeed pregnant and that the child's father was definitely not Thaddeus Blackwood. When pressed for details, Lysandra simply smiled and spoke of a lover who had visited during her isolation, providing no name or description that could be verified. The golden eyes that sometimes flickered in her gaze suggested truths that no official report could contain. Thaddeus received the news of Lysandra's survival and pregnancy while closing a business deal that would have finalized his control over her inherited assets. The color drained from his face as Detective Shaw, who had taken a particular interest in the case, explained not only that his wife was alive, but that she was pregnant with another man's child and had extensive evidence of his attempted murder. Plot: the pregnancy's timeline, which proved the child had been conceived after his abandonment, would destroy any claim he might have to being the wronged party in a divorce. Moreover, Lysandra's documentation of finding his journal and the poisons he had used, combined with financial records showing his purchase of the remote property, painted a damning picture. The legal proceedings that followed became the stuff of regional legend. Lysandra appeared in court heavily pregnant, radiating an otherworldly beauty that made hardened attorneys stumble over their words. She testified with perfect clarity about Thaddeus's systematic abuse, the poisoning that had caused her blackouts, and the deliberate abandonment intended to cause her death. When asked about the pregnancy, she maintained her story of a lover who had found her at the farm, providing just enough plausible detail to satisfy legal requirements while revealing nothing of the truth. The baby's unusual development was attributed to the stress of her ordeal and the peculiar environmental factors of the isolated farmland. Thaddeus's defense crumbled spectacularly. His own journal proved his premeditation, and forensic analysis of Lysandra's hair samples showed traces of the hallucinogens he had administered. The financial trail revealed his desperate gambling debts and the life insurance policies he had taken out on Lysandra without her knowledge. Most damning was the testimony of his mistress, who revealed that Thaddeus had promised to marry her once his problem was resolved and his wife's inheritance secured. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding him guilty of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. But the true reckoning came the night Lysandra gave birth, during a thunderstorm that locals would speak of in hushed tones for generations. The child that emerged was beautiful beyond description, with features that seemed to shift between perfectly human and something altogether other depending on the angle of observation. Its eyes were golden, as promised, holding an intelligence that no newborn should possess. The midwife who attended the birth, a woman versed in the old ways, recognized the signs immediately and performed protective rituals that had been passed down through her family for precisely such occasions. Thaddeus learned of the birth from his prison cell, where he was serving the first year of a 20-year sentence. The photographs showed a child that could not possibly be his, with coloring and features that belonged to no earthly ethnicity. What the photographs couldn't capture was the way plants grew toward the infant, the way animals gathered protectively around the farmhouse, or the way the very air seemed to sing when the child laughed. His fellow inmates reported that Thaddeus aged a decade overnight, his hair turning white as he finally understood that forces beyond his comprehension had turned his cruel plan into his own damnation. The child grew at an accelerated rate, walking within months and speaking in complete sentences before its first birthday. Lysandra raised it on the farm that had become her sanctuary, teaching it both human ways and the older wisdom she had gleaned from her otherworldly experiences. The local community, initially wary, came to accept them as part of the mountains. Strangeness, especially after the child's abilities manifested in helpful ways. Sick livestock recovered after the child's visits. Failing crops flourished where it played, and the savage winter storms that typically plagued the region seemed to curve around the hollow where they lived. Detective Shaw maintained contact with Lysandra, fascinated by the case that had challenged everything she thought she knew about reality. She became something of a protector, deflecting official interest and ensuring that mother and child were left in peace. In return, Lysandra shared fragments of truth about the larger world hidden behind the mundane facade, preparing Shaw for Other cases that would require an open mind and a willingness to accept the impossible. Their friendship became a bridge between worlds, each protecting the other's secrets. The farmhouse transformed over the years from a place of intended death to a beacon of life. Lysandra established a sanctuary for women escaping abusive situations, teaching them the survival skills that had saved her, and providing a safe space for healing. Some visitors reported strange dreams during their stays, visions of golden-eyed beings offering strength and protection. A few left pregnant despite swearing they had been with no one, their children bearing subtle marks of otherness that would manifest in times of need. The cycle continued, ancient bloodlines reawakening as the world grew stranger and the boundaries between dimensions grew thin. Thaddeus died in prison during the child's 5th year, driven mad by dreams of golden eyes and the sound of wings. His death was officially listed as a heart attack, though his cellmates swore he had been screaming about burning figures and a child that walked through walls to visit him in the night. Lysandra felt his passing like the lifting of a shadow, the last chain binding her to her former life dissolving into nothingness. She stood in her garden that night, her child's hand in hers, watching the stars align in patterns that spelled out names in languages humanity had forgotten. The child's true father revealed himself fully only once, on the summer solstice of its 7th year. The visitation lasted from sunset to dawn, reality bending to accommodate a presence that existed in more dimensions than human senses could process. Lysandra finally understood the full scope of what she had become part of, a cosmic plan to preserve magic in a world increasingly hostile to wonder. The hybrid children were seeds of transformation, carriers of abilities that would become necessary as humanity faced challenges beyond conventional understanding. Her abandonment had been orchestrated by forces far greater than Thaddeus's petty malice, turning his cruelty into an unwitting service to powers that transcended human comprehension. Years flowed past like water, each bringing new revelations and challenges. The child, who chose the name Phoenix despite Lysandra's suggestions of more conventional options, grew into a being of remarkable power and compassion. It could heal with a touch, speak to the spirits of the land, and step between dimensions as easily as walking through doorways. Yet it remained fundamentally human in its capacity for love, protecting its mother and the women who sought sanctuary at the farm with fierce devotion. The golden eyes that had marked its heritage became a symbol of hope for those who knew to look for such signs. Lysandra aged slowly, the connection to her child and the energies of the land preserving her vitality well beyond normal human limits. She became a legend in her own right, the abandoned wife who had transformed betrayal into triumph, weakness into strength, isolation into community. The farm expanded, buildings rising that seemed to grow from the earth itself, shaped by Phoenix's abilities and the collective will of the women who made it their home. Gardens flourished in defiance of climate, orchards bore fruit that healed both body and spirit, and the veil between worlds grew so thin that wonder became commonplace. The story spread beyond the mountains, carried by the women who had found healing at Lysandra's sanctuary and by the children born of mysterious circumstances. Academic researchers, attempting to study the phenomena, found their equipment malfunctioning, their memories becoming fuzzy, their reports automatically redirecting to tales of unusual weather patterns and statistical anomalies. The protection surrounding the farm was both supernatural and bureaucratic, Detective Shaw having risen to a position where she could deflect official scrutiny while building a network of those who understood the importance of preserving such places On the 20th anniversary of her abandonment, Lysandra stood in the same spot where she had discovered her pregnancy. The farmhouse now unrecognizable as the decrepit structure Thaddeus had chosen for her tomb. Phoenix stood beside her, no longer child, but not quite adult by human standards, its form shifting between solid and ethereal as it communed with both worlds simultaneously. They were not alone. Dozens of women and children moved through the gardens, each carrying their own story of transformation, their own connection to the forces that had turned intended tragedy into transcendent victory. The pregnancy test had long since crumbled to dust, but its significance remained etched in Lysandra's memory. That moment of discovery had been the first domino in a cascade that reshaped not just her life, but the lives of countless others. Thaddeus's betrayal had opened a door he never knew existed, allowing ancient powers to reclaim a foothold in a world that desperately needed their return. The child he had made possible through his cruelty would never know him as father, but its existence would ripple through generations, a living reminder that even the darkest intentions could be transformed into light by forces beyond human understanding. As night fell over the farm, bringing with it the familiar thinning of the veil, Lysandra watched Phoenix lead a group of children in a ritual older than recorded history. Their golden eyes caught the moonlight as they danced, their movements creating patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Each child was a bridge between worlds, proof that the ancient compacts still held power, that humanity's future lay not in separation from the mystical, but in conscious partnership with it. The abandoned wife had become a mother not just to Phoenix, but to a new paradigm, nurturing seeds of transformation in the fertile ground of her hard-won sanctuary, the ham radio in the attic. Now a relic of desperate times, occasionally crackled to life with reports of other sanctuaries emerging around the world. Women who had faced similar abandonments, similar betrayals, were discovering that their darkest moments had been catalysts for connections to powers that waited just beyond the veil. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, suggesting an orchestration beyond human comprehension. Each story shared common elements: isolation, desperation, mysterious pregnancies, and children who carried the mark of something greater than human heritage. Lysandra had begun compiling these stories, creating a record that would survive even if the sanctuaries themselves fell. The leather-bound journal that had once documented her survival now contained accounts from dozens of women, each tale a thread in a tapestry that revealed the shape of things to come. Phoenix helped with the translations, able to read meaning in languages that predated human speech, adding context that transformed individual experiences into a coherent narrative of species-wide transformation. The influence of the sanctuary spread in subtle ways, carried by visitors who left with more than just healing. Seeds from the garden produced plants that thrived in impossible conditions, carrying trace elements of the otherworldly energies that saturated the farm. Water from the well, bottled and shared, carried healing properties that persisted even when diluted. Most significantly, the children born at or influenced by the sanctuary carried abilities that manifested when needed most, creating a growing network of individuals capable of bridging the mundane and mystical worlds. Opposition arose, as it always did when established order faced transformation. Religious fundamentalists declared the sanctuaries abominations. Scientists struggled to explain phenomena that defied conventional understanding, and government agencies attempted surveillance that invariably failed due to equipment malfunctions and agent disorientation. But for every force that sought to suppress or control what was emerging, 10 more individuals experienced personal transformations that opened their minds to larger possibilities. The tipping point approached inexorably, carried forward by children who saw no contradiction between technology and magic, between human achievement and otherworldly assistance. Phoenix's abilities evolved as it matured, developing skills that suggested its true purpose was not merely to exist, but to teach. It could awaken dormant abilities in others, particularly those who carried trace elements of the old bloodlines. Workshops at the sanctuary began, including lessons in what Phoenix called dimensional awareness, teaching visitors to perceive and interact with layers of reality normally hidden from human senses. Some students progressed rapidly, developing abilities that ranged from enhanced intuition to full communication with non-human intelligences that had always existed alongside humanity. The night Phoenix turned 21 by human reckoning, though its true age was impossible to calculate given its non-linear existence. The barriers between worlds dropped entirely for a full lunar cycle. The farm became a focal point for a gathering that included beings from multiple dimensions. All drawn by the success of the hybrid program, Lysandra, now bearing the title of Bridgekeeper in the Old Tongue, facilitated negotiations that would determine humanity's relationship with these ancient powers for generations to come. The abandoned wife who had once cowered on a farmhouse floor now stood as an equal among entities that had witnessed the birth of stars. The accords reached during that gathering established frameworks for cooperation that respected both human autonomy and the needs of the returning powers. The hybrid children would serve as ambassadors and bridges, their dual nature allowing them to translate between worlds that had grown to separate for direct communication. Sanctuaries, like Lysandra's, would be protected and allowed to proliferate, providing safe spaces for the transformation to unfold naturally. In return, the ancient powers would share knowledge and abilities that would help humanity navigate the challenges of a rapidly changing world. From climate catastrophe to the expansion beyond Earth that lurked in the species' near future, Thaddeus's name appeared one final time in the narrative when researchers investigating the patterns of abandonment that preceded sanctuary formation discovered his journal in prison archives. His detailed plans had inadvertently created a template that the ancient powers had coopted, turning his methodology for isolation and destruction into a recipe for transformation and empowerment. The irony was lost on Thaddeus himself, who had died believing he was haunted by delusions, never understanding that his precisely calibrated cruelty had been transformed into an instrument of cosmic purpose. The child he had declared impossible became the prototype for a new form of human evolution, one that integrated rather than rejected the mystical elements of existence. Phoenix's siblings, for dozens of hybrid children now existed around the world, formed a council that guided the transformation with wisdom beyond their apparent years. They understood both human nature and cosmic purpose, able to navigate the complexities of integration without forcing either side to abandon its essential nature. The abandoned wives who had borne them became revered figures, their stories told and retold as examples of how the darkest betrayals could become doorways to unimaginable transformation. Lysandra lived to see the world change in ways she could never have imagined during those desperate first days at the farm. Technology and magic merged into new disciplines that defied old categories. Cities redesigned themselves to accommodate multiple dimensional phases, and children grew up considering it perfectly normal to have playmates who existed partially in other realities. The pregnancy that had seemed like a curse or delusion became recognized as the first note in a symphony of transformation that reshaped human civilization from its foundations. Her memorial, when she finally passed at an age that should have been impossible for a baseline human, was attended by thousands in person and millions more through dimensional viewing. Phoenix spoke for hours, its voice carrying across multiple planes of existence, telling the story of a woman who had transformed abandonment into abundance, betrayal into blessing, isolation into integration. The farmhouse, now a registered historical site existing in 17 dimensions simultaneously, became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to understand how individual transformation could catalyze species-wide evolution. The pregnancy test that had started it all was recreated in crystal, suspended in the sanctuary's museum as a reminder that the most profound transformations often began with impossible revelations. Visitors studying the artifact often reported visions of their own potential transformations, glimpses of futures where their greatest wounds became sources of unexpected strength. The golden-eyed children who served as guides would smile knowingly, understanding that every person carried the potential for connection to forces beyond conventional reality, waiting only for the right catalyst to awaken. In the end, Lysandra's legacy was not merely the survival of one abandoned wife or the birth of one impossible child. It was the proof that humanity's next evolutionary leap would not come through technology alone, but through the integration of all aspects of existence that fear and rationalism had long suppressed. The farm in the hollow between mountains became a symbol of that integration, a place where the impossible became routine and the abandoned found not just shelter but transformation. The story continued long after Lysandra's passing, carried forward by Phoenix and its siblings, by the women who found sanctuary and strength in places of intended suffering, and by the children who grew up considering wonder a birthright rather than an aberration. Each generation built upon the foundation she had laid, expanding the network of sanctuaries, deepening the connection between worlds, and proving repeatedly that the darkest betrayals could become doorways to unimaginable possibilities. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, Golden Eyes watched with satisfaction as the seeds planted through suffering bloomed into a garden of transformation that would sustain humanity through challenges yet to come. The abandoned wife had become the mother of a new world. Her pregnancy, the first labor pain of a species giving birth to its own transcendent future. Thaddeus's cruelty, intended to destroy, had instead catalyzed a transformation beyond his petty imagination, proving that in the grand tapestry of existence, even the darkest threads could be woven into patterns of impossible beauty.